The air still tasted of ozone and burnt insulation, a metallic tang that clung to the inside of my respirator. Through the fogged visor, I surveyed the devastation. This wasn't just a lab, it was a fortress, a high-security vault where Dr. Aris Thorne had sequestered himself and his world-changing research. Now, it looked like a bomb had detonated in a particularly expensive antique shop. Fluorescent lights, some still flickering stubbornly, cast a sickly yellow glow over the scene. Twisted metal struts protruded from what used to be a reinforced ceiling panel. Glass shards, some no larger than grains of sand, glittered across the scorched floor, mingling with pulverized circuitry and unidentifiable organic matter. My boots crunched softly with every step, a sound amplified by the eerie silence that followed the initial chaos. The emergency services had done their work, extinguishing the small, tenacious fires. The stench of chemicals and something vaguely organic remained, a constant, low thrum against my senses. Reed, glad you could make it, the lead investigator, a burly man whose voice always sounded like he'd swallowed gravel, greeted me from behind a yellow tape. His eyes, tired and red-rimmed, swept over the wreckage. Looks like a bad one, huh? Overpressure event. Maybe a runaway reaction. The preliminary reports are pointing to either a tragic accident or, given Thorne's reclusive nature, a self-inflicted end. I nodded, adjusting the fit of my gloves. Any survivors? Just Thorne. And he didn't make it. The lead investigator gestured towards the center of the room. The forensics team is already documenting. It's a mess, but the initial read is pretty clear. Clear. The word always made my hackles rise. Nothing in my line of work was ever truly clear. Every scene, no matter how straightforward it seemed, held a secret if you knew where to look. I stepped over a tangle of severed cables, my gaze already sweeping, cataloging, processing. The sheer force required to achieve this level of destruction was immense. The primary blast zone, marked by a concentrated scorch pattern, was precisely where Thorne's main console would have been. My eyes found the body. Dr. Thorne lay amidst the debris, partially obscured by a fallen workstation, his form contorted, lifeless. Even from a distance, the extent of the trauma was evident. His lab coat, or what remained of it, was fused to his skin in places, a testament to the intense heat. The scene screamed accident, catastrophe, unforeseen chemical reaction. The narrative was already writing itself, echoing in the hushed conversations of the other investigators. They were looking for confirmation, for the final piece that would seal the case as an unfortunate incident. But I wasn't looking for confirmation. I was looking for dissonance. I moved closer, past the colleagues meticulously photographing every angle, past the evidence technicians carefully bagging fragments. My focus narrowed, the world outside the perimeter fading. I knelt a few feet from Thorne's body, careful not to disturb anything. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of char and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Not metallic. Not organic. Almost. Sterile, yet acrid. The blast had been immense. The sheer energy released had buckled the high-grade steel of the work surfaces, vaporized delicate instruments, and left a crater-like depression in the reinforced floor. Thorne's position suggested he had been standing directly in front of his console when the event occurred, likely caught in the epicenter. His hands, or what was left of them, were splayed outwards, fingers curled, suggesting a last, desperate attempt to shield himself or perhaps reach for something. I leaned in, my breath fogging my visor again. My eyes traced the outline of his right hand. The skin was blackened, the bone underneath visible in places. But it was the edges of the burn, where the extreme heat had met the less affected tissue, that caught my attention. A distinct pattern emerged. Almost like a faint, geometric etch. It wasn't the irregular, chaotic charring I would expect from a purely thermal blast. It was too precise. I pulled a small, high-magnification lens from my kit, extending its arm. Through the lens, the pattern became clearer. Not a burn, not exactly. More like a series of microscopic, crystalline structures embedded in the very edge of the charred flesh, shimmering faintly under the lab lights. They were minute, barely visible to the naked eye, certainly not something anyone else seemed to have noticed in the macroscopic chaos. They didn't look like carbon residue, or any common byproduct of a lab explosion I'd ever encountered. My mind raced, cycling through known chemical reactions, explosive compounds, thermal signatures. None of them produced anything like this. This wasn't the residue of a simple thermal runaway. This was something else. Something applied. I stood up slowly, my gaze drifting from Thorne's hand to the surrounding debris, then to the nearest wall. The structural damage was consistent with an internal explosion, yes, but the pattern on Thorne's hand. It didn't fit. An internal tremor of unease started in my gut. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. This was an act, meticulously planned, executed with a level of sophistication that went beyond a mere lab mishap. Someone had weaponized something I didn't recognize, something designed to mimic an accident while leaving a signature so faint, so alien, that only a forensic eye trained to ignore the obvious would ever find it. I glanced back at the lead investigator, still conferring with a colleague near the entrance, already mentally filing away the case as a tragic, if spectacular, incident. They were looking at the grand picture of destruction. I was looking at a single, almost invisible thread that threatened to unravel it all. My determination solidified. Thorne hadn't simply made a mistake, and he hadn't taken his own life. Someone else had. And they had been very, very clever. But not clever enough. Not for me. The sterile hum of the examination room was a stark contrast to the volatile chaos of Thorne's lab. Here, under the cool, unforgiving lights, the human element of the catastrophe lay before me. The examiner, a man whose hands moved with practiced, almost detached efficiency, gestured to the deceased. Cause of death, catastrophic internal trauma consistent with a massive pressure wave, followed by thermal injuries, the examiner stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Initial assessment points to an accidental detonation of the bioreactor. Suicide by miscalculation, perhaps. Or just a tragic misstep. Clear. There it was again. The word grated. I leaned closer to the body on the stainless steel table. Thorne's face, what remained of it, was frozen in a rictus of surprise, not agony. His body, however, told a different story. The thermal burns were superficial in places, deep and charring in others, but the pattern struck me as peculiar. Not the radiating scorch of a single, central explosion, but something more. Directional. Almost as if the heat had been applied, rather than erupted. And the internal trauma? I asked, my gaze tracing a faint, almost invisible abrasion on Thorne's left forearm, near the wrist. It was too clean for a blast, too precise. Massive blunt force. The pressure wave was immense, read. Organs ruptured, bones fractured. Standard for a contained explosion of that magnitude. The examiner pointed with a forceps to a section of Thorne's chest. See the bruising here? Classic impact trauma, likely from being thrown against a solid surface. I nodded, not entirely convinced. The abrasion on the forearm bothered me. It wasn't just skin deep, it looked like something had dug in, leaving a faint, elongated furrow. A straight piece of debris? Maybe. But my gut said otherwise. The examiner merely grunted, turning to log his findings. I focused on Thorne's hands, often the last point of contact, the silent witnesses to a final struggle or frantic effort. Under the magnification of my loupe, I found it. Not a large piece, barely a speck, nestled deep within the cuticle of Thorne's right index finger. It was a dark, almost iridescent shard, no bigger than a grain of sand. Too small to have come from the lab's shattered glass or scorched metal. Too distinctive. I carefully collected the fragment, placing it into a microvial. Any other foreign material? I asked, knowing the answer would be no. The examiner had been looking for gross contaminants, not microscopic anomalies. Negative, he confirmed, without looking up. My mind raced. This tiny shard was my first true lead. It didn't belong. It wasn't part of Thorne's high-tech, pristine lab. It was an intrusion, a silent scream of defiance against the accident narrative. Later that afternoon, the first round of interviews began. I sat across from the rival scientist, Dr. Silas Vance, in a small, windowless interrogation room at the precinct. Vance was impeccably dressed, his posture rigid, his eyes darting. He spoke with a controlled cadence, a rehearsed regret. Aris and I, we had our differences, certainly, Vance admitted, smoothing a wrinkle on his expensive suit jacket. Professional disagreements. His methods were often unorthodox. Reckless, even. But to suggest anything more? It's absurd. We were competitors, not enemies. His research, I probed, world-changing, some called it. Did you have any interest in his final project? Vance hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Of course. Everyone did. But my own work is quite distinct. I wouldn't compromise my integrity for a shortcut. His gaze hardened, a flash of resentment flickering in his eyes. Thorne was always one to hoard his data, keep his breakthroughs under lock and key. It made collaboration, and even friendly competition, difficult. His words, though carefully chosen, painted a picture of deep-seated professional animosity. Thorne's secrecy, Vance's ambition, a potent cocktail. Next was the former research assistant, Maya. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair disheveled. He fired me, she blurted out, her voice raw with indignation, not grief. Said I was distracting. Said I asked too many questions. I helped him build that project, piece by piece, and he just discarded me. What kind of questions? I asked, leaning forward. About the ethical implications. About the risks. He was so consumed, so driven. He cut corners, read. I saw things.
Things he didn't want anyone else to know.
Her eyes, though tear-rimmed, held a defiant spark. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also dangerous. He thought he was above the rules. Did he have enemies beyond professional rivals? She scoffed. Everyone he alienated. He had a way of making people feel small. But a specific enemy? No. Just a lot of people who would have liked to see him fall on his face. Myself included, at times. Her anger felt genuine, her resentment palpable. He had access, knowledge of the lab's intricacies, and a clear motive for revenge. Back at my desk, the microvial with the tiny shard sat under my desk lamp, a silent challenge. The initial lab analysis came back. It was a fragment of aged, highly compressed parchment, interwoven with traces of a specific mineral dust not commonly found in the region, nor in a modern research facility. My colleague in materials forensics, an older woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure particulates, had narrowed it down. That mineral dust, Reed, he'd said over the phone, it's unique. Often associated with historical paper preservation. And the parchment itself. It's old, very old. Not museum quality, but definitely not something you'd find at an office supply store. Or a bioengineering lab. I cross-referenced the mineral dust with known historical sites, archives, and even abandoned industrial facilities. One result pinged, an old record from a forgotten municipal inventory, a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The description included details of the building materials, the preservation methods used for its extensive, outdated archives, and the unique geological composition of the underlying earth. It was a long shot, but the details matched the profile of the fragment perfectly. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows as I drove. The psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records loomed, a derelict monument to forgotten suffering. Dust motes danced in the last vestiges of twilight filtering through grime-streaked windows. The air was thick with the scent of decay, mildew, and ancient paper. Thorne, the brilliant bioengineer, had a fragment of this place under his fingernail. That accident felt further away than ever. The mineral dust from the previous scene, now identified, gnawed at me. The old records, the building materials, it all pointed to something specific, something that didn't fit with Thorne's gleaming, futuristic lab. But one mystery at a time. My priority was Thorne's research, the heart of his empire, and potentially the key to understanding his demise. I re-entered the blast-scarred research chamber, the air still tasting faintly of ozone and scorched metal despite the ventilation systems working overtime. Yellow tape crisscrossed the access points, but the lead investigator had granted me full clearance. The corporate security officer, a man with a perpetually furrowed brow, merely nodded as I passed, his gaze sweeping the damaged interior. My eyes went straight to the central workstation, its reinforced glass panel cracked, but its internal components, remarkably, seemed intact. Thorne had built this place like a fortress, even from the inside. Maya, Thorne's assistant, sat hunched on a bench in the adjacent observation room, a thin, almost translucent figure against the muted gray walls. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. She looked smaller than I remembered, her usual sharp focus replaced by a vacant stare. "Maya," I said, my voice low, trying not to startle her. She flinched, her eyes, wide and bloodshot, darting to me. "Investigator Reed," his voice was a whisper, raspy. I need to access Dr. Thorne's research files. His main project data. She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. Everything is encrypted. And backed up off-site, of course. He was very particular. I'm aware. I have the necessary protocols. What I need is your access level, if you still have it. Or any insights into his recent activity on the network. She looked away, her gaze fixing on a distant point on the floor. He was different these last few weeks. Jumpy. He'd lock himself in, sometimes for days. Said he was close to something monumental. Something that could change everything. Change everything how? I pressed, leaning slightly closer. A shiver ran through her. He wouldn't elaborate. Just global. He mentioned global implications. And then the paranoia started. He thought he was being watched. That someone was trying to get to his work. I dismissed it, of course. He was under immense pressure. Her voice trailed off, a fresh wave of fear washing over her face. Did he ever mention who might be watching him? Or what they wanted? No names. Just them. He became obsessed with data security, installing new firewalls, running diagnostics constantly. He even started using a separate, isolated server for his most sensitive work. Said it was the only way to be sure. This was new. An isolated server. It complicated things, but also pointed to a deliberate effort on Thorne's part to hide or protect something significant. Where is this server? Maya pointed vaguely towards the main lab. Behind the main console. Heavily shielded. You'll need his biometric data, or a complete system bypass. I thanked her, her vague answers leaving me with more questions than clarity, and walked back into the main chamber. The air here was heavy, charged with the ghost of a catastrophic event. I navigated around the twisted metal and shattered equipment, my eyes scanning the damage, searching for anything out of place beyond the obvious destruction. The central console, though scarred, hummed with residual power. Bypassing Thorne's advanced security protocols was a meticulous dance. Each line of code, each firewall, was a testament to his genius and his increasing paranoia. It took hours, the glow of my screen illuminating the grim scene around me. I finally gained access to the primary network, then the isolated server Maya had mentioned. The file structure was complex, layered, but I cut through it, searching for the core project files. Thorne's primary research, labeled simply Genesis, was a deep dive into advanced genetic sequencing, focusing on highly specific protein structures with potential for rapid cellular regeneration. The implications were staggering: global health applications, certainly, but also, undeniably, the potential for a new class of bioweaponry, far more potent and insidious than anything currently conceived. I began sifting through the project logs, looking for recent activity. The dates and times blurred together, a torrent of data. Then I saw it. Access logs from an unknown IP address, not internal, not a recognized collaborator. It was a phantom, appearing and disappearing like smoke. And then, the timestamps. A flurry of activity just days before the explosion. Downloads. Deletions. My fingers flew across the keyboard.
I cross-referenced the deletion logs with the remaining files.
Specific project files, concerning the advanced regeneration protocols and their potential for rapid host adaptation, had been targeted. Not just deleted, but overwritten multiple times, a sophisticated attempt at a complete data wipe. But Thorne, brilliant as he was, hadn't accounted for the forensic ghost files, the digital echoes left behind even after the most aggressive purges. I began the painstaking process of reconstruction.
Someone had accessed Thorne's most sensitive research.
Someone had tried to erase crucial data.
Was it Thorne himself, trying to hide something he'd created, something too dangerous to exist? Or was it the them Maya had mentioned, an external party who had gained access, either through coercion or brute force, and then attempted to cover their tracks after securing what they wanted?
The meticulousness of the wipe, the specific targeting of files, suggested a deep understanding of Thorne's work.
This wasn't a random hack.
This was surgical. The blast was a smokescreen, designed to hide the theft of something profoundly dangerous. And the trail led directly into the heart of Thorne's secrets, searching for anything that didn't fit the narrative of a tragic mishap. My gaze snagged on a microscopic glint near a scorched console, almost invisible against the blackened surface. The heat of the blast should have vaporized or melted most foreign objects, yet this fragment, resilient and anomalous, remained. I carefully extracted it using a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, placing the minuscule evidence into a sterile sample vial. This wasn't something I'd seen before in a lab of this type, especially not one dedicated to biological engineering.
Its metallic sheen had an unusual hue, almost iridescent under the beam of my penlight.
This tiny piece, if it proved to be anything other than common debris, could be the thread that unraveled the whole story. Back in my own lab, the air was sterile, the silence broken only by the hum of diagnostic equipment. I prepped the sample, mounting it under the electron microscope. The image resolved on the screen, a jagged, crystalline structure, unlike any standard metal alloy or ceramic. The machine word, processing wavelengths, atomic compositions, and molecular bonds. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each flicker on the monitor building a profile of the unknown substance. The results finally populated the screen, stark against the dark background. It wasn't a metal, nor a ceramic. It was a polymer, but one unlike anything in conventional databases. The spectral signature was unique, a complex arrangement of synthetic elements. My internal database, a repository of thousands of industrial materials, finally flagged a match. A rare, high-performance synthetic polymer, custom-engineered for extreme durability and thermal resistance. Its use was highly specialized, typically found in advanced aerospace components, deep-sea exploration vessels, or high-end industrial applications where conventional materials failed. This wasn't a lab accident. Thorne wouldn't have been working with something like this in his bioengineering research. This polymer spoke of external force, of something brought into the lab, designed to withstand immense heat and pressure. It redirected my entire focus. The initial suspects, academic rivals, disgruntled former colleagues, faded. This pointed to something larger, something corporate. I started cross-referencing Thorne's funding sources, his collaborative projects. One name surfaced repeatedly, a behemoth in industrial innovation, Omnicorp. A conglomerate known for its aggressive R&D, its insatiable appetite for groundbreaking technology, and its tendency to acquire or neutralize any independent research that might threaten its market dominance. They were a primary funder of Thorne's, a silent partner in his revolutionary work.
The polymer's unique signature, its resilience, it felt like something Omnicorp would develop, something proprietary.
A meeting was arranged with Omnicorp's liaison, a man named Mr. Finch. The furniture was sleek, minimalist, almost aggressively modern. Finch himself was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his smile a practiced, almost unnerving, display of cordiality.
"Reed, thank you for coming," Finch began, gesturing to a chair opposite his vast, polished desk.
His voice was smooth, a well-oiled machine.
"A tragic loss, Dr. Thorne.
Truly devastating for the scientific community, and of course, for Omnicorp.
He was on the cusp of, well, something truly extraordinary."
I settled into the chair, observing him. He leaned back, hands clasped, a picture of corporate concern.
Too perfect.
"My investigation is still ongoing," I stated, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm looking into all aspects of Dr. Thorne's work and his associations." Omnicorp was a significant partner.
"Indeed," Finch affirmed, a slight nod.
"We provided substantial funding, resources, and access to our proprietary research facilities when needed. We believed in Thorne's vision."
"And what exactly was that vision, from Omnicorp's perspective?" I pressed, watching his eyes. They flickered, almost imperceptibly, before regaining their composed facade. "Proprietary biological applications," he said, a touch too quickly. "Advanced cellular regeneration, that sort of thing. Highly sensitive, of course."
We were merely facilitating his genius, hoping to bring his discoveries to
broader humanitarian uses.
"Humanitarian uses," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "My analysis of the lab site suggests a catastrophic event, yes, but also points to the presence of a rare synthetic polymer.
One with extreme thermal and structural properties. Do you recognize it?"
I laid a magnified image of the polymer's spectral analysis on his desk. Finch leaned forward, his polished facade cracking just a fraction.
His gaze lingered on the image, a micro-expression of recognition, quickly suppressed. I can't say I do, Reed," he said, his voice a little tighter now.
Omnicorp works with thousands of materials across its various divisions.
Without knowing the exact application, it's impossible to identify. It could be anything.
It's not just anything, I countered, leaning forward slightly.
Its signature is highly specific. It's designed for environments of immense heat and pressure. The kind of conditions that might be generated by
a very deliberate act.
Finch swallowed. "Are you suggesting foul play, Reed?"
His tone shifted, a subtle defensive edge entering his voice.
"Because I assure you, Omnicorp is fully cooperating. We have nothing to hide. Dr. Thorne's death was a profound blow. I'm suggesting the evidence points away from a simple accident," I clarified.
"And this polymer is a critical piece of that evidence."
"Does Omnicorp develop or utilize such a material in any of its industrial applications?"
He hesitated, a thoughtful frown now etched on his brow. "It's possible," he conceded, "given the breadth of our operations. We have advanced materials divisions.
But I can't confirm anything without consulting our R&D archives. That would require. We want to assist in any way possible to bring clarity to this tragedy. He was too eager, too smooth. This man, and by extension Omnicorp, was hiding something significant. Leaving the Omnicorp tower, the city lights blurred into streaks of color. The polymer was a direct link, a physical fingerprint pointing towards a corporate hand. Thorne's humanitarian uses suddenly felt like a convenient cover story. The true nature of his research, and its corporate implications, were far more dangerous than I'd initially imagined. I needed more than just a material inventory. I needed context. I thought of the dusty files, the forgotten histories. My mind drifted to the kind of forgotten repository that might hold such truths, a place like a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, where paper trails stretched back decades, undisturbed. It felt like the next logical, if unconventional, step. The tension was palpable now, a silent pressure building, telling me I was on the right track, and walking into something far bigger than a lab accident. The hum of the mass spectrometer was a low, steady drone, a counterpoint to the rapid-fire clicks of my keyboard. Finch's slick dismissal still grated, but it had only sharpened my focus. Omnicorp was a wall, and I was looking for a crack. The polymer, that microscopic fleck found on Thorne's workspace, was my crowbar. Its molecular structure was proving stubbornly unique, a signature I hadn't seen in any standard database. Not a common industrial resin, not a known lab compound. This wasn't some off-the-shelf plastic. I ran another series of analyses, cross-referencing against more obscure patents, historical chemical journals, even declassified government reports from decades past. The composite was complex, almost artisanal in its construction, hinting at a very specific, perhaps even proprietary, manufacturing process. It had a peculiar metallic additive, so minute it was almost undetectable, yet it altered the polymer's electrical conductivity in a very specific way. This wasn't just a material, it was a tool, designed for a purpose. Hours bled into the late afternoon. My eyes ached, but a faint flicker on the screen caught my attention. The researcher, a brilliant but disgraced biochemist named Elias Vance, had published a handful of articles before his abrupt disappearance from the academic world. His work, deemed too radical and ethically questionable even then, involved enhancing material properties through highly specific, almost biological, catalysts. The last known professional affiliation listed for Vance was a facility that, according to my quick online search, had been repurposed multiple times before being completely abandoned. And, crucially, its archival records were last transferred to a specific location. I packed my minimal gear, the image of Vance's name glowing on my screen. The lead felt tenuous, yet it was the only one I had that pointed away from Omnicorp's carefully curated narrative. I needed those records. The drive across the city was uneventful until I reached the industrial outskirts. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. I was halfway through an intersection, the light clearly green in my favor, when a black sedan swerved from the opposite lane, cutting directly into my path. There was no warning, no horn, just the sudden screech of tires and the visceral lurch of my own vehicle as I slammed on the brakes, twisting the wheel. The sedan missed my front bumper by mere inches, a blur of dark paint and tinted windows, before accelerating away without so much as a glance in my direction. My heart hammered against my ribs, a raw, frantic drum. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. That wasn't an accident. The driver had been deliberate, aiming for my car, then peeling off as soon as I reacted. A warning or an attempt? Someone knew I was getting too close. The icy certainty of it settled deep in my gut. I took a moment, breathing deeply, before continuing my journey. The address led me to a desolate, overgrown lane, bordered by skeletal trees. At the end stood a sprawling, dilapidated complex, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Moonlight began to cast long, eerie shadows across its crumbling facade. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, reflecting nothing but the gathering gloom. The air was thick with the smell of decay, damp concrete, and forgotten lives. I found an unsecured service entrance, the metal door groaning in protest as I pushed it open. The wing dedicated to records was a labyrinth of mildewed corridors, stacked floor to ceiling with rusting filing cabinets and collapsing cardboard boxes. The smell here was even worse, a cloying mix of paper, dust, and something indefinably stale, like trap time. I spent the next 2 hours sifting through decades of forgotten bureaucracy. Patient files, personnel records, administrative documents, all decaying into illegibility. My lead on Vance felt like grasping at smoke. Then, tucked away in a mislabeled cabinet behind a stack of purchase orders from 1993, I found it, a small, leather-bound ledger, distinct from the official forms. Vance, E. Research notes and material logs. My flashlight beam danced across the faded ink. Detailed descriptions of experimental polymer compounds, their unique properties, and the catalysts used. And there it was, on page 73, a precise chemical recipe for a metallic additive that matched the one I'd found in Thorne's lab. Vance had called it the resonance catalyst. He'd abandoned the research due to its extreme instability and toxicity, but the potential applications were clear, even back then. This was Thorne's starting point. This was the source of the polymer. I photographed every relevant page, my fingers sticky with the grime of the past. The ledger felt heavy, not just with age, but with the weight of its implications. Thorne hadn't invented this from scratch, he'd resurrected a forgotten, dangerous path. The near miss earlier played on a loop in my mind. Someone was watching. I uploaded the photos, cross-referencing Vance's notes with my own findings. The match was undeniable. Thorne had somehow stabilized Vance's unstable catalyst, making the impossible possible. I reached for my coffee mug, then stopped. It was on the left side of my desk. I always left it on the right, next to my monitor. A small detail, easily dismissed. But I was meticulous, almost obsessive, about the layout of my workspace. Nothing else seemed out of place. My secure server was still locked, my microscope still covered. Yet, the mug. This wasn't a warning, it was a message. I know where you work. I can get in. Someone had been here. They hadn't stolen anything, hadn't overtly vandalized. They had simply moved a mug, a subtle violation meant only for me to discover. The hair on my arms stood on end. My lab, my sanctuary, had been breached. Just then, my phone vibrated. Maya's name flashed on the screen. I answered, my voice taut. Read. Read, I need to tell you something, he stammered, his voice thin with fright. I'd been so scared, but after what happened today, I saw the news report about your car. I know it wasn't an accident. What are you talking about, Maya? I pressed, my heart rate accelerating. Before. Days before. Late at night. They were accessing Thorne's lab. Not through the main entrance, not through the service corridor. They used a hidden access panel, one I didn't even know existed. I only caught a glimpse, but they weren't any of the regular research staff. They moved like they owned the place. I thought it was just Thorne working late, but then I realized it wasn't him. And I never saw them leave. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The polymer source, the attempted vehicular hit, the breach of my lab, and now Maya's terrified confession. This wasn't a tragic accident, or even a simple murder. This was a calculated, sophisticated operation, and I was deep in the crosshairs. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to kill Thorne and cover their tracks, and they were willing to do the same to me. The metallic taste of dread lingered in my mouth. This wasn't just a homicide, it was a hostile takeover of a brilliant mind's legacy, and I was now a primary obstacle. The meticulous nature of the attack on Thorne's lab, the precision required to simulate an accident, spoke volumes. This wasn't some random act of violence, it was a surgical strike, executed by someone who understood Thorne's world better than anyone else. I needed an environment where I could work without interruption, without surveillance. My own lab was compromised. The facility where Thorne's body had been discovered was swarming with official personnel. I recalled an old, forgotten building, a relic from a different era. I drove to the edge of the city, pulling up to the weathered gates of what used to be a mental care facility. The sign, half-rotted, still read St. Jude's. I navigated the overgrown path, the vehicle's tires crunching on loose gravel. The building itself was a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Inside, a specific section had been designated for archiving. I found the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten lives. Here, amidst the stacked cardboard boxes filled with patient files and administrative ledgers, I set up my temporary digital forensics station. It was isolated, remote, and hopefully, secure from the killer's reach. I had salvaged the core data logs from Thorne's lab, environmental controls, security footage, partial, unfortunately, equipment diagnostics, and the bespoke system's internal event recorder. The sheer volume of data was daunting, but I knew the devil was in the details. I started with the environmental controls. Thorne's lab was a hermetically sealed environment, designed to precise specifications for his volatile research. Oxygen levels, atmospheric pressure, temperature, specific gas concentrations, all meticulously logged. I scrolled through the data streams, my gaze fixed on the moments leading up to the incident. Everything appeared normal, then a subtle flicker. A fractional drop in pressure, so minute it would be dismissed as sensor noise by an untrained eye. Then, an equally subtle increase in a specific inert gas, followed by a slight temperature spike. These weren't anomalies, they were orchestrated. Simultaneously, I worked on the physical reconstruction. Back at the actual lab, under the watchful eyes of the investigating officers, I'd spent hours documenting every scorch mark, every shattered component, every residue trace. The initial assessment pointed to a catastrophic failure of Thorne's experimental reactor, a runaway reaction. But my observations told a different story. The primary burn pattern wasn't originating from the reactor core itself, but from a peripheral conduit, a feeder line for a specialized atmospheric compound. The residue analysis I'd performed on site,
a quick field test, showed traces of a highly reactive catalyst, introduced externally, not a byproduct of Thorne's intended process. I projected the lab schematic onto a dusty wall in the abandoned wing, cross-referencing my physical findings with the digital logs. The puzzle pieces began to interlock, forming a grim mosaic. Stage 1, the remote pressure drop. Not enough to trigger an alarm, but just enough to create a minute negative pressure differential. Stage 2, the introduction of the inert gas, carefully metered. It wasn't meant to cause an explosion directly, but to destabilize the atmospheric equilibrium Thorne had so carefully maintained. Stage 3, the temperature spike, localized and brief, targeting a specific conduit. This wasn't a general lab overheat, it was surgical. Stage 4, the external catalyst injection, precisely timed with the destabilized atmosphere and localized heat. This wasn't Thorne's experimental compound failing, it was a targeted chemical weaponization of his own system. The sequence was too perfect, too precise to be an accident. It mimicked a catastrophic meltdown of Thorne's research, yet every step was a deliberate manipulation of his bespoke environmental and equipment systems. The killer hadn't just understood Thorne's work, they had reverse-engineered his safety protocols, twisted his own brilliant design against him. The inert gas, the localized heat, the external catalyst, each element designed to trigger a specific, devastating chain reaction that would appear to be an internal failure. The killer knew the exact pressure thresholds, the specific gas mixtures, the precise points of vulnerability in Thorne's cutting-edge reactor. This level of intimate knowledge wasn't something you could glean from publicly available papers or even a general corporate espionage brief. This was someone who had either worked directly with Thorne, or had privileged, unfettered access to his most sensitive, proprietary data, the kind of access only a trusted confidant or a deeply embedded rival would possess. That accident was a masterpiece of sabotage, designed to erase Thorne and his project without leaving a trace of the true culprit. But I saw the seams, the deliberate choices. This wasn't just murder, it was an intellectual assassination, orchestrated by a ghost who knew Thorne's mind almost as well as Thorne himself. And that realization deepened the mystery, tightening the noose around my own neck. My gut twisted with the realization that I had underestimated the scale of the threat. And if I didn't move fast, I'd be next. The detective had been relentless, questioning me about Maya, about the details of the lab breach. I gave him what I could without compromising my own ongoing investigation, knowing full well that my evasiveness would only deepen his suspicion. He was doing his job. I needed to find something Thorne had hidden, something he wouldn't trust to his primary lab, a place that would be meticulously scoured by his killers. My mind kept circling back to a cryptic entry in one of Thorne's older, less secure journals, a single, faded address scrawled beneath a doodle of a forgotten symbol. The drive was long, the landscape slowly morphing from urban sprawl to overgrown fields and derelict structures. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. When I finally pulled my vehicle to a stop, the building loomed before me, a skeletal frame against the bruised sky. This was it, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The sheer scale of its decrepitude was startling. Windows stared out like vacant eyes, many shattered, others opaque with grime. A rusted iron fence, bent and broken in places, marked its perimeter. I parked my vehicle behind a cluster of overgrown cedars, hoping its presence wouldn't attract unwanted attention. I pulled my tactical flashlight from my kit, the beam cutting a stark path through the twilight gloom.
My boots crunched on shards of glass and crumbling plaster as I moved deeper into the structure. Rows of filing cabinets, overturned desks, and forgotten equipment lay scattered like the bones of some forgotten beast. My focus was on the old records part of the building's name. If he wanted to hide something truly sensitive, something too dangerous for his primary research facility, he'd put it somewhere overlooked, somewhere that felt innocuous despite its ominous appearance. I navigated through what must have been administrative offices, then into a vast, cavernous room lined with shelves, many collapsed, others groaning under the weight of countless dusty folders. This was it, the archives. The air here was thicker, laced with the acrid tang of decaying paper. Patient records, administrative documents, financial ledgers, a lifetime of forgotten bureaucracy. I worked systematically, my gaze sharp, looking for anything out of place, anything that screamed Thorne. His symbol, a unique angular mark he used to sign off on sensitive documents, was my target. Hours bled into each other. My fingers were grimy, my throat dry from the dust. Just as fatigue threatened to overwhelm me, a flicker of something unusual caught my eye. Not a folder, but a small, unassuming data stick, wrapped in a scrap of faded linen. Thorne's symbol was etched faintly into the plastic casing. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. I didn't dare connect it to my secured laptop here. The risk of an ambient data trace, or worse, someone tracking my activity, was too high. I carefully placed the data stick into a shielded pouch, my mind already racing through the implications. I needed a secure environment, somewhere I could analyze this without alerting anyone. I connected the device through a series of anonymizing proxies and isolated systems. The stick was clean, no obvious traps. But when I tried to access the main data, a formidable encryption wall blocked me. Thorne hadn't just hidden the data, he'd locked it down. This was Thorne's signature, a multi-layered cryptographic puzzle. The air grew taut with my concentration. Then, with the software of the system, a folder unfurled. Not a research log, not a dataset, but a personal journal, dated months before his death. The entries were raw, agitated. Thorne detailed his growing unease. He spoke of his discoveries being twisted, not for the betterment of humanity, but for its control. He didn't just fear his work being stolen, he feared it being weaponized in a way he never intended. And then came the true shock. Thorne wasn't just having ethical concerns, he was planning to expose Omnicorp. Not just the weaponization of his research, but their funding of a separate, more dangerous project, something he called Project Chimera, a bioengineered pathogen with targeted lethality. My breath hitched. This wasn't about stealing intellectual property. This was about silencing a whistleblower. Thorne wasn't just a brilliant scientist, he was a moral compass, about to point directly at the heart of a corporate monster. The killer hadn't just wanted his research, they wanted to bury the truth he was about to unleash. And now, I held that truth in my hands. The implications were staggering, reaching far beyond the confines of a single lab accident. This wasn't just murder, it was an act of corporate espionage and global sabotage. A faint creak echoed from the outer corridor of my temporary refuge. My head snapped up, my senses instantly on high alert. I was alone, or so I thought. The sound was too deliberate, too close, to be the building settling. Someone knew I was here. Someone had followed me from the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records.
The hidden motive had just become my most dangerous secret. My gut twisted with a cold certainty. They knew I was getting too close. Fear, for me, was a catalyst, sharpening the edges of my focus. I pushed the threat aside, compartmentalizing it for later. Digital logs were scrubbed clean, physical evidence meticulously removed or altered. The sophistication spoke volumes. This wasn't a random act, it was a surgical strike by someone who understood the intricate dance of Thorne's world. I needed to think outside the immediate perimeter. Corporate archives, especially those pertaining to sensitive projects or personnel, were often fragmented, especially across different eras of a company's existence. Omnicorp, like many conglomerates, had swallowed smaller entities, each with its own history, its own skeletons. I remembered a passing comment from an old records manager, a colleague who handled the truly ancient files, about an off-site storage location for pre-digital era documents. It was a long shot, a dusty, forgotten corner of corporate memory. My borrowed vehicle, a nondescript sedan, cut through the late afternoon traffic, heading towards the city's older industrial fringe. The address led me not to a typical warehouse, but to a decaying brick edifice, its windows mostly shattered, lines clinging to its crumbling facade. Above the rusted iron gates, barely legible, were the faded remnants of a sign that once read St. Jude's Sanatorium. Now, it was simply a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on broken plaster and the occasional creak of settling timbers. The front reception area was a tableau of forgotten lives, an overturned desk, scattered papers, a child's forgotten doll staring blankly from a dusty shelf. I navigated through the labyrinthine corridors, guided by the old records manager's vague directions, until I found a section marked Corporate Archives, Annex B. It was a misnomer. This wasn't an annex, it was a tomb. Rows upon rows of metal shelving, rusted and sagging, held file boxes stacked precariously high. I pulled out my headlamp, its beam cutting through the gloom. My target, anything related to Omnicorp's early days, its acquisitions, and crucially, any past incidents involving stolen intellectual property. Hours blurred into a monotonous rhythm of pulling boxes, sifting through yellowed documents, and coughing through the thick, musty air. My fingers grew grimy, my eyes strained. Most of it was administrative dross, defunct project proposals, and quarterly reports from a bygone era. Its label was stark: Internal Review, Project Nightingale, IP Compromise. The contents were fascinating. A detailed account of a sophisticated industrial espionage incident from nearly 2 decades ago. The report described a breach that mirrored the precision of Thorne's demise, an intimate knowledge of internal systems, a meticulously planned exfiltration of data, and a suspect who vanished without a trace. The internal review cited an outside consultant brought in to assist with the recovery effort. His name jumped off the page, David Thorne. I found his consultant profile next. Not just a cybersecurity expert, as I'd initially assumed from his Omnicorp liaison role, but a background in specialized intelligence retrieval and covert asset protection for a defunct security contractor with ties to government agencies. The language was carefully sanitized, but the implications were clear: this wasn't a desk jockey. He was an operative. My gaze drifted back to the Project Nightingale file. The report detailed how the consultant, David Thorne, had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate the perpetrator's moves, almost as if he understood their methodology intimately. He'd tracked down the stolen data, but the individual responsible had slipped away. The sophisticated sabotage, the precise knowledge of Aris Thorne's lab, the meticulous cover-up, it all pointed to someone with not just technical skill, but operational expertise. David Thorne, the Omnicorp liaison, the man who had been so helpful, so eager to assist my investigation, had a history that now screamed inside man. He wasn't just familiar with intellectual property, he was familiar with stealing it, and with the kind of intricate planning that left no trace. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on me. A cold dread settled in my stomach, far deeper than the dust I was breathing. He had the access, the motive, and the cold-blooded efficiency I'd come to associate with the killer. My next move had to be surgical, a precise cut designed to expose the nerve. Aris Thorne's research, his breakthrough, was the key, but what aspect? What would make a killer, already convinced their tracks were covered, risk exposure? It wasn't about the discovery itself, but the implications of the discovery. I fabricated a leak. Not about the polymer, not about the burn patterns. Something far more abstract, yet potentially devastating to Omnicorp's hidden agenda. I drafted a cryptic, internal memo, ostensibly from a low-level data archivist, detailing the unearthing of anomalous, early-stage research notes from Aris Thorne's pre-Omnicorp work, hinting at a foundational, undisclosed precursor to his later projects. The memo suggested these notes were found within a forgotten archive, specifically citing the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, a location so obscure and seemingly irrelevant that only someone intimately familiar with Thorne's personal history or Omnicorp's deep-seated secrets would understand its true significance. I planted it where I knew the Omnicorp liaison's automated internal sweep would flag it, a digital ghost in the machine. Then, I waited. The silence was a hammer, each tick of my watch a slow, deliberate strike against the reinforced concrete walls of my patience. I didn't sleep, fueled by stale coffee and the grim satisfaction of a plan set in motion. My phone vibrated just after midnight. A notification from the security system I discreetly installed at the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Motion detected. In the archive section. I moved with a practiced economy of motion, grabbing my kit. The drive was a blur of streetlights and the low hum of the engine, my mind already rehearsing the confrontation. I parked a block away, approaching on foot. The building was an imposing shell, its windows like vacant eye sockets. The lock on the archive entrance, a heavy steel door, had been expertly bypassed. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and settled dust, undisturbed for decades until now. A single beam of light cut through the gloom emanating from deeper within the archives. My breath plumed in the frigid air. I moved silently, my footsteps swallowed by the worn linoleum. There, hunched over a stack of yellowed folders, was David Thorne. He was systematically tearing pages, stuffing them into a bag. "Looking for something specific, David?" I asked, my voice cutting through the rustle of paper. He froze, his head snapping up. The flashlight beam swung wildly before settling on me, blinding for a moment. His eyes, when I could finally see them, were wide with a raw, animal fear I hadn't seen before. The suave, composed Omnicorp liaison was gone, replaced by a man caught in the act. "Read," he stammered, scrambling to compose himself, but his hands shook as he fumbled with the papers. "What? What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," I replied, stepping further into the aisle, letting the ambient light from the distant street lamps outline my form. "I thought you were busy overseeing the final stages of the cleanup at Thorne's primary lab. Not rummaging through forgotten history. Just checking on some old records," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its composure, though the tremor remained. "Omnicorp policy. Ensuring proper documentation." He tried to sound nonchalant, but his gaze kept darting to the bag in his hand. "These aren't Omnicorp records, David. Not yet, anyway. These are Aris Thorne's personal early notes, a theory he developed long before he joined your ranks. A theory about a unique biopolymer, one that could be weaponized, but also one that leaves a distinct, microscopic residue." I watched his face closely. The flicker of recognition, the subtle tightening around his eyes, it was all there. "Funny thing, that polymer. I found traces of it. Not just in Aris Thorne's lab, intricately woven into the catastrophic damage, but also at those 3 accidents involving the key researchers who were privy to his work." His jaw clenched. He dropped the bag, the papers scattering across the dusty floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," I countered, stepping closer. "Enough to know that the trace polymer, specific to Thorne's unpatented early work, was present at every scene. The burn pattern in his lab, specifically designed to incinerate organic matter while leaving certain inorganic compounds intact, including that polymer. Inside, a minuscule, iridescent filament. Matches, David. From the collar of one of the deceased researchers, from the scorched floor of Aris Thorne's lab, and from under the fingernail of the security chief who supposedly fell down a flight of stairs. All identical. All unique." He sank onto an overturned crate, his shoulders slumping. He stumbled onto something. A project. Not his. Something Omnicorp had been developing in parallel. A bioweapon. He saw its potential, its horrific implications, and he threatened to go public. My stomach turned. "Bioweapon?" He nodded, not meeting my gaze. "A faction within Omnicorp. High level. They tasked me. I was the liaison, I had the access, the trust. I was to neutralize him, make it look like an accident. And anyone else who might have known too much. The polymer. It was part of the delivery system, designed to break down rapidly, leave no trace. But Aris, in his final moments, he tried to fight back, tried to leave a sign. The full horror of it settled over me. And I, Reed, had just unearthed the confession. The confession, raw and chilling, had barely left David Thorne's lips before the world outside the interrogation room began to tilt. My hand, still clenched around the recording device, felt the phantom vibration of a city waking up to a nightmare. I'd seen plenty of confessions in my career, but none with the seismic potential of this one. It wasn't just about a brother's betrayal, it was about the monstrous truth Aris Thorne had died to expose, a truth that implicated an entire corporate structure. The tactical team moved with swift, silent efficiency. David Thorne, pale and hollow-eyed, offered no resistance as they led him away. The senior detective, a woman whose face usually held the stoicism of granite, met my gaze with a mixture of grim satisfaction and utter disbelief. "You found it." "Reed," he murmured, the words barely audible. "All of it." "He wanted it found," I replied, watching David Thorne disappear down the corridor.
Aris made sure of that. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Omnicorp's gleaming towers felt the tremor. Initial reports, cautious and cryptic, morphed into a media frenzy. High-profile executives, their faces plastered across every screen, were being led from their offices in handcuffs. The sheer scale of the deception, the calculated risks taken with human life for profit and advancement, was staggering. It wasn't just a lab accident, it was a systemic rot. I watched the news cycles from my cramped apartment, the glare of the screen reflecting in my tired eyes. The public's shock was palpable, a mix of outrage and morbid fascination. Commentators argued late into the night, dissecting the ethics of scientific ambition, corporate responsibility, and the very definition of progress. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls from various agencies, all wanting to pick apart the details, to understand the mechanism of a conspiracy so meticulously hidden. I answered them, my voice flat, relaying the facts without embellishment. The facts were enough. Yet, a persistent thread tugged at me, a lingering question that David Thorne's confession, comprehensive as it was, hadn't fully answered. Aris Thorne's final journal entries had hinted at a deeper history, a pattern of experimentation that predated his own groundbreaking work, referencing archived trials and forgotten subjects. It suggested Omnicorp's reach extended further back, its ethical lines blurred long before Aris had even conceived of his project. I spent an entire day sifting through obscure corporate filings and property deeds, tracing Omnicorp's dormant assets. The trail led me to an address on the forgotten edge of the city, a place long since struck from official records but still technically owned by a shell company linked to Omnicorp's earliest days. It was a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, a sprawling, decrepit structure that looked like a forgotten relic. I moved slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating rows of steel filing cabinets, their drawers jammed shut. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step a protest against my intrusion. This wasn't just neglect, it was deliberate abandonment, a place designed to be forgotten. I found them in a corner office, behind a collapsed bookshelf, tucked away in a locked, fire-resistant safe that had somehow survived decades of disuse. The lock was old, simple, and with a bit of patience and the right tools, I coaxed it open. Inside, meticulously organized, were ledgers and journals dating back 60 years. These weren't David Thorne's machinations, these were the blueprints for a legacy of scientific hubris, detailing early, unregulated human trials, the disposability of life, and the systematic suppression of dissenting voices. Aris Thorne hadn't just stumbled upon a current conspiracy, he had unearthed a generational one. His research, meant to heal, had been twisted to perpetuate the very abuses his predecessors had perfected. The documents laid bare the foundation of Omnicorp's empire, built on a bedrock of ethical compromises and human suffering. This was the monstrous truth, the deep root Aris had sacrificed himself to expose. The implications were staggering. Governments and international organizations, initially focused on the immediate fallout, would now have to contend with the historical weight of Omnicorp's transgressions. The future of Aris Thorne's research, once a beacon of hope, now hung in a precarious balance, a weapon that could be wielded for good or ill, depending on who seized control. My job, I knew, was far from over. The real fight had just begun. The air in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records was a thick, stagnant blanket woven from dust and forgotten despair. Sunlight, filtered through grimy, gridded windows, did little to dispel the gloom.
It merely illuminated motes dancing in the oppressive stillness, like tiny, lost spirits. I stood by a warped wooden desk, its surface scarred by decades of neglect, the faint scent of mildew and decaying paper clinging to my clothes. The Thorne case, now officially closed, felt less like a resolved puzzle and more like a heavy stone lodged in my chest. The ripple effect had been immediate and devastating, just as I'd predicted. Omnicorp's gleaming towers had indeed felt the tremor, but it was the quake that followed, shaking the very foundations of public trust in scientific endeavor, that truly resonated. Initial reports, cautious and cryptic, had morphed into a media frenzy. The name Aris Thorne became a flashpoint, his research, once a whispered marvel, now a public spectacle of ethical debate. The perpetrator, exposed not by a grand confession but by the relentless accumulation of microscopic truths, had gone from a respected colleague to a symbol of ruthless ambition. The motive, when laid bare, was as old as humanity itself, power and control over a discovery too profound to be left to the victim's singular vision. I traced the edge of a faded file folder on the desk, its label illegible. This case wasn't just about the meticulous reconstruction of a crime scene or the identification of a killer. It had been a dissection of ambition, a deep dive into the moral vacuum that sometimes existed at the cutting edge of progress. Thorne's groundbreaking work, designed to reshape the understanding of biological processes, had been twisted, nearly weaponized by another. The thought left a bitter taste. Every detail, from the unusual burn pattern on the lab floor to the microscopic trace of a unique contaminant on Thorne's person, had been a breadcrumb in a labyrinth of deceit. Each discovery had pulled me deeper, forcing me to confront not just the mechanics of the murder, but the profound ethical implications that underscored it. I remembered the grim satisfaction of finally piecing together the timeline, the precise sequence of events that led to Thorne's demise. The perpetrator hadn't just killed a man, they had tried to steal a future, to hijack a legacy. It was a weight that accumulated, case by case, etching lines of weariness around my eyes, deepening the quiet spaces within me. It wasn't just about catching the killer, it was about bearing witness to the lengths humanity would go for its desires, both noble and depraved. There were days, especially in the thick of the investigation, when the cynicism threatened to overwhelm. But then I would remember Thorne himself, not just as a victim, but as a man who genuinely believed in the betterment of the world. And I would remember the subtle, undeniable truth that resided in the evidence, patiently waiting to be found. It was in those moments, in the quiet triumph of fact over fabrication, that my resolve hardened. This was why I did what I did. Not for glory, certainly not for peace, but for the unwavering belief that truth, however inconvenient or painful, must always prevail. Thorne's case was closed. The perpetrator was contained, the stolen research secured. There was a sense of finality, a grim satisfaction that the truth had seen the light of day. But true closure, I knew, was a myth. The questions Thorne's work raised, the ethical tightrope walk between progress and peril, would continue long after the headlines faded. Science marched on, relentless and indifferent, constantly pushing boundaries, constantly creating new opportunities for both salvation and destruction. My work, I realized, was a never-ending vigil at that precipice. I picked up a brittle, yellowed patient ledger from the desk, its pages filled with elegant, looping script from a bygone era. My fingers brushed over the faint indentations where a pen had pressed decades ago. The past, contained in these dusty records, felt a world away from the gleaming, high-tech lab where Thorne met his end. Yet, the threads of human nature, ambition, and vulnerability ran unbroken through both. A distant phone buzzed, a sharp, insistent sound cutting through the sepulchral quiet of the wing. It was a colleague from the precinct, their voice already laced with urgency. "Reed," they began, "we've got something. A new one. Another lab, this time out east. Very unusual." I exhaled slowly, the dust mote still dancing in the slivers of light. The struggle continued. And so, it seemed, did I.